Welcome to The Explainer. Have you ever stopped to wonder why the vast majority of the Christian world observes Sunday as their day of rest and worship, especially when the biblical commandment explicitly designates the seventh day, Saturday, as the Sabbath? Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating, historically rigorous look at one of the greatest shifts in ecclesiastical history. We'll be looking directly at the historical record to understand exactly how this massive metamorphosis of holy time actually happened. It really is the ultimate question, isn't it? If you read the text all the way from Genesis to Revelation, you simply won't find a divine biblical mandate changing the day of rest. You just won't. The thesis we're exploring today is that the shift to Sunday was not some sudden biblical decree, but rather a gradual evolution. It was driven by a really complex confluence of sociopolitical pressures, anti-Jewish theology, imperial legislation, and ecclesiastical decrees. It's an incredibly human story. Okay, let's dive right into this. We're going to trace this great historical shift by looking at the intense political pressures of Rome, analyzing Emperor Constantine's pivotal Sunday law, and uncovering the ecclesiastical enforcement at the Council of Laodicea. And finally, we'll weigh scripture against church tradition to see what it means to joyfully embrace the Sabbath today. So, where do we even begin? Let's start by looking at the great historical shift right after the apostolic period to see what early believers actually did following the resurrection. Now, you might be thinking, didn't the early church immediately and universally start worshiping on Sunday? And to be fair, early believers did indeed begin to hold common assemblies on Sunday to commemorate the resurrection and the first day of creation. Writers like Justin Martyr document this. But there's a profound theological distinction we have to make here. Gathering for fellowship and instruction on Sunday did not constitute a theological transfer of the Sabbath. Those early Sunday gatherings simply didn't carry a divine command to cease from secular labor. In fact, if we look at the historical record, it totally flips the assumption that the early church immediately abandoned the seventh day. Historians like Socrates Scholasticus and Zosimon actually documented that well into the 5th century, almost all Christian churches throughout the world continued to celebrate the Sabbath every single week. The main exceptions? Alexandria and Rome. So if it wasn't an immediate, universal change, what exactly caused the shift in those specific locations? Well, to understand that, we have to look closely at Rome and the intense anti-Jewish pressure of the time. There were intense political realities in the Roman Empire that essentially acted as a wedge, forcing early Gentile Christians away from the biblical Sabbath. Let's map this out for a second to see how it builds. Following the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, and then the brutal Bar Kokhba revolt that ended in AD 135, the Roman Empire developed a fierce, even violent hostility toward Jewish practices. And over the next few centuries, this political reality would completely reshape Christian practice, paving the way for Constantine's decrees and formal church councils. You see, for early believers, distancing themselves from the Sabbath wasn't just a theological debate, it was literally about survival. Emperor Hadrian had issued decrees outlining circumcision and Sabbath keeping. On top of that, the Romans levied a crushing tax, the Fiscus Judaicus, specifically on Jewish people. So to avoid brutal persecution and taxation, Gentile Christians, especially in the capital of Rome and in Alexandria, started actively cultivating an identity distinctly separate from Judaism. And you can really see this quest for a safe, separate identity bleeding into the theology of the early church fathers. Leaders in the Roman Church actually began encouraging believers to fast and mourn on the Sabbath, to make the day feel gloomy while elevating Sunday as a day of joy. Justin Martyr went so far as to claim the Sabbath was imposed on Jews solely as a mark of their sins. Origen spiritualized it, and Eusebius argued that Sunday was simply better than Mosaic law. This growing anti-Jewish sentiment was the fertile soil where the Sunday shift truly took root. Which brings us to a massive turning point, Constantine's Venerable Day. To understand the imperial catalyst that permanently altered the socio-legal fabric of the Christian church, we have to look at the emperor himself. On March 7th, AD 321, Emperor Constantine drops the very first civil Sunday law. He decrees, "On the venerable day of the sun, let the magistrates and people residing in cities rest, and let all workshops be closed." It's so important to recognize that this wasn't a biblical decree, it was a civil mandate. And a specific wording he used here is absolutely fascinating. Constantine was a lifelong devotee to the sun cult, Sol Invictus, and he held the pagan title of Pontifex Maximus. By phrasing his decree around Venerabilis Deus Solis, the venerable day of the sun, he pulled off a brilliant political maneuver. The pagan majority could honor the sun god, while the Christian minority could honor the resurrection of the Son of God. Constantine's imperial economic power basically provided the framework that socialized a whole new generation into Sunday rest. Now we move to the Council of Laodicea. Some might argue, well, Constantine's law didn't really matter because Sunday was already universally established by then. But think about it, if Sunday had naturally and peacefully replaced the Sabbath in the first century, we wouldn't expect the institutional church to still be aggressively fighting Sabbath observance hundreds of years later. Just look at Canon 29 from the Regional Council of Laodicea around AD 364. It specifically decrees that Christians shall not be idle on Saturday but must work on that day, and it adds a really severe penalty. If, however, they are found Judaizing, they shall be shut out from Christ, anathema. This is highly revealing. The very threat of excommunication proves that widespread Sabbath-keeping was still heavily practiced in the late 4th century. It was forcefully suppressed by church authority, not gently transitioned by the apostles.
So, having traced all these historical timelines, we have to face the real theological elephant in the room, the fundamental tension between Scripture versus church tradition.
What's incredibly interesting here is a very candid admission from Roman Catholic authorities regarding this shift. Cardinal James Gibbons famously wrote, "You may read the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, and you will not find a single line authorizing the sanctification of Sunday. The scriptures enforce the religious observance of Saturday, a day which we never sanctify." It's a really striking acknowledgement that this change is rooted entirely in tradition, not the biblical text. Even the Convert's Catechism of Catholic Doctrine openly echoes this, confirming that the observance of Sunday was established at the Council of Laodicea. But as our source material reminds us, mere historical practice cannot nullify the Decalogue. Jesus himself warned in Matthew 15 against substituting God's law with the commandments of men. Ultimately, the authority of Scripture has to weigh heavier than the traditions of empires and councils. All right, stepping back from all this historical analysis for a moment, what does honoring the biblical Sabbath actually look like today? Because it really is meant to be a joyful call to rest. A lot of people today hear Sabbath keeping and immediately think, oh, that's legalism. But honestly, that's a total misunderstanding of the nature of God's law. Legalism is a human attempt to earn salvation through restrictive works and rules. True Sabbath observance is the exact opposite. It is the joyful cessation of our own works so that we can rest entirely in the finished work of our Creator and Redeemer. It's not some pharisaic burden, it is literally a weekly sanctuary in time. Just listen to how the prophet Isaiah describes it. He calls believers to call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord honorable. It's a divine invitation to step off the treadmill of our frantic, exhausting, self-sufficient lives and to dedicate 24 hours to unhurried communion, physical rejuvenation, and just seeking God's pleasure. So the crucial point is this. The true essence of the biblical Sabbath is about delight. It's worship, rest, mercy, and covenant faithfulness. Because the seventh-day Sabbath was instituted by God at creation, enshrined in the Ten Commandments, and honored by Jesus himself, it stands as a perpetual moral imperative and, more importantly, as a profound, beautiful gift. Which leaves us with a really compelling question. The historical record is unambiguous. Scripture never changed the Sabbath. The shift was the result of human history, politics, and tradition. So, knowing this, will you step out of the rushing current of tradition? Will you study the scriptures for yourself and consider returning to the delightful biblical rest that Yahweh designed for you from the very beginning? Thank you so much for joining us on this journey through history on The Explainer. Keep learning, keep seeking, and we'll see you next time.